he's a researcher who's researching quite a bit on grants and grants programs these days, and looking ahead, he'll talk about these programs, how effective they are, and what are the ideal setups for the space. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for having me. So, yeah, I'll be speaking about why use Airtable to fund projects in Web3. And disclaimer, I'm not from Airtable, but anyone who has applied for a grant must have come across like this Airtable form where you just, you fill in all your information and you just hope for the best. So we'll be speaking a little bit about like different ways of applying grant funding, but also what that means for grantees. So let's just give it a quick introduction. We're going to continue with the state of the art, and then we'll actually dive deeper into Web3 grants, what it means, Web3 versus conventional. I just came back from a workshop where we actually had some government entities also speaking, or people speaking on their behalf. So we'll dive a little bit into the differences and similarities. And in the end, we're going to talk a little bit about what that and what you can take away as a grantee or grant program operator. All right, are you actually able to see these slides? Yeah, probably there. Cool. So who of you has submitted a grant application already? Okay, there, 1, 2, 3. All right, and you probably in the end saw like a screen like, thank you for your application. That might have been on Airtable, and you wondered what is next. Now, take a look to your left and to your right. Chances are that there's someone who set up this program. So who wondered, how can we engage with grantees? What questions do we need to ask? And how do we actually apply this funding so that both grantees and the program, the ecosystem, benefits from it? Now, from speaking with grant program operators, we have learned that setting these things up are actually hard. Now, for all of you who have repeatedly applied for grants, you see that these grant programs often change, and then there's a new program coming up. So when we look in the quotes that we have here from the Web3 or State of Web3 Grants report from the MetaGov Grant Innovation Lab, grant program operators reported that they are using Airtable and that different categories for different grants, for different projects, over different verticals, keep popping up, keep changing. So it's really difficult to properly fund projects that are meaningful for an ecosystem, for a community, for a project, or even a token. So where are we overall? So programs are recognizing that one monolithic grant structure, like one catch-all grant program application isn't actually working. Furthermore, when we look at what is after the funding, when we talk about impact, so impact means, for example, token go up, versus outcomes, we have a lot of meaningful projects that are doing good work and that are perhaps even generating cash flow, then these two things are conflated. So on one hand, we have impact that is on an ecosystem level, so how do we meet our KPIs? And on the other hand, we have these projects that are, even if they don't hit the KPIs of the program, potentially are thriving. And this is not really clear what is in between and how do we distinguish them. Furthermore, talking about tracking success, so how do we actually measure whether someone meets KPIs, whether they have outcomes, whether these outcomes are meaningful? That's not quite clear, and it's difficult to do. And then when we look at more, let's say, participatory grant programs like Optimism or Arbitrum, then we always see that there is a DAO and there are some operators and they are somehow entangled, and it's not quite clear who is getting the grants based on whose decision and what reasons. So there's like a lack of transparency that hampers efficiency. Now, all of this kind of portrays Web3 grants at the crossroads. So we can either opt for more transparency, for grantee empowerment, or we can just stay where we at and kind of, omit all the transparency measures that we could take. So generally, I was just right before this talk speaking about with one of the organizers here about accelerator style programs, and programs are realizing that money alone is not enough. You actually need to go in hands-on, work with these projects so that they can really thrive. At the same time, when we look at what we can learn from conventional grant programs, and grant programs have existed for quite some time, like 40, 50 years ago, grants started to pop up. We see that Web3 grant programs aren't actually that dissimilar to conventional or government grants, and that even if money is not enough, we might need to think harder about how we can make this work. So overall, Web3 grants see little standardization, but they have some promising bottom-up approaches that just need to be put to work. So when we look at government programs, they have actually quite a lot of freedom of information, regulations that they need to apply to. They're quite rigid and bureaucratic in the way to apply. So you actually need to have a lot of maturity as a grantee to be able to apply to that. So for example, you need to have a legal entity set up. You need to be able to write, 3, 4, 5 pages of state-of-the-art and background and what you're actually trying to achieve. And then there's some bureaucrat who's going to make this decision. Web3 grants in this regard are different, but also similar because we see these forms on Airtable becoming longer and longer. So that's why distinguishing between Web3 grants and conventional grants actually still matters. Now, when we think about what grants actually mean, we can determine that a grant is a financial donation, so it's different to venture capital funding, where people actually want a stake in your company, and it's meant as a subsidy to spark innovation, to drive adoption. But other than meeting these outcomes and hitting these KPIs, they don't ask for much back. So they don't ask to be part of your company or owning a stake. So when we now think about Web3 grants specifically, we have often cryptocurrencies involved, we have DAOs involved. All of you who apply to grants want this token, maybe even up on TGE or right after. And DAOs are using grants to distribute their funding or their token sales through grants. Tyco is a good example. They launched their grant program before they had a token, and then kind of used the grant program to get the token into circulation. And generally this crypto economic take on grants is marketed as improving efficiency, making grants better, making them less bureaucratic. But well, is that actually true? Because where's the economy, the crypto economy in Airtable? You advertise that you're using crypto to distribute grants, but at the same time, you're using a simple web form to collect responses. So it's not all good and shiny, but we actually need to make sure that Web3 is delivering on what it promises. So that's why we developed a mixed method Web3 grant maturity model. So we are looking at grant operator self-assessment. So we actually went and talked to Web3 grant operators, asked them how they're doing, how they are applying crypto economic principles, how they distribute the funds, how they engage with grantees, and how they evaluate their performance. But then we also looked at very quantitative measures, such as how the outreach over social media translates into grantee applications. So how many grantees or potential grantees applied. We also looked at how the grantee number and the funds are distributed. And we established a model where we basically had a higher, better logic. So higher scores in one of these sub-indicators translates into a better score overall. So where does it leave us? We have 6 different categories that we have scored. So we have focus areas and objectives, something like, do we actually define, or does the grant program actually define what they want to achieve with this program? Then we have program structure and organization. That means, okay, who's actually running that? So are we outsourcing that? Is that done in-house? Who's responsible for what? And where are we set up? Which leads me to the 3rd category, governance, where we looked at where is this foundation or company that is distributing the grant actually is located. So what we saw is a lot of Cayman Islands, a lot of places where people might not look too closely or are kept from looking too closely. And we also saw a couple of DAOs distributing funds. Like, for example, BitDAO for Mantle is one example. We also have Optimism and Arbitrum evaluated, where a DAO somewhat relates to a foundation, and the foundation sort of has the last say in, or the last word in, who's getting that grant and whether they completed KYC. And in the 4th category, we looked at effectiveness and impact. So is it actually effective how we distribute grants? Do they reach the intended impact and outcomes? And the last 2 categories, transparency and accountability, as well as community engagement, looked more at like what is the PR side of things. So do these grant programs talk to grantees, talk to their community, give their community a voice in how tokens are being allocated. So this is essentially stakeholder engagement. Now, the model you just saw, this one, of course there is much more detail to it, and whoever is interested, I'm happy to share more in a 101 or 1 to N constellation after this talk. But this is an example for the Arbitrum programs, where we have the short-term incentive program, we have the short-term incentive program back fund, which is actually a really good example of lacking maturity, because so Arbitrum went out and said, well, we're just going to fund an experiment for a short term. And then some shareholders or token holders said, well, actually, we want to keep playing this experimentation game a little longer, so let's just create this back fund. And this back fund was, of course, approved by the DAO, but what that actually means was not that clear. We also have these SDIP bridge, which is the back fund after the back fund, sort of. And lastly, we have the long-term incentive program. Now, when you look at how governance is done at Arbitrum, you have a skewed decision-making towards large token holders that are decentralized exchanges and so on. So we see decision-making predominantly benefiting large projects rather than small grantees. So whenever you apply as a grantee, I advise you have a look at the governance and see whether you actually stand a chance to apply. So the model you saw basically outputs a number between 0 and 1. We have converted that into relative numbers. So we have percentages here. We have that is a normalized composite. So we actually make sure that we're not comparing apples to oranges. And we see the lowest maturity on the STIP and STIP back fund grant program with 38.11%. STIP bridge is a bit higher at 42, and then LTIPP is at 50%. Now, what does that actually mean? that is not on the slide, but I'll explain it to you anyway. We were thinking about like maturity in terms of experimental, foundational, developmental, and advanced maturity. So when you think about numbers between 0 and 1, you can have a very naive approach and say, well, we're just going to divide it into quartiles. So we have 0 to 25% is experimental maturity, 25 to 50 is foundational, anything above 50% but below 75 is developmental, and then we have advanced maturity. Now in the case of Arbitrum, Arbitrum did not reach an advanced maturity, and maybe this is not even intended because we are not talking about government programs where a lot of bureaucracy, very lengthy application forms are involved. But we are Web3 and we want to experiment and we want to figure out what works and what doesn't. So a takeaway for both grantees and grant operators here is that grantees should be very strategic about where to apply, how to apply, and not just look at this fancy Airtable that promise you to get 100K for free, because that's not the case. But actually dive into the governance, look at how different grant programs allocate their funding, what the backstory is to these grant programs and their existence. And now a lesson to grant operators, you can use whatever is practical. So be practical, use Airtable. These crypto economic promises and shiny Web3 things might not be as shiny as you think they are, because at the end, grantees and projects really just want to be able to rely on something that works. But you really should send that rejection email if you do not want to fund the project. I know the focus shifts more towards success, and we want to allocate as much time as possible to successful projects, but making sure that all those who were not successful are also kept in mind ensures that you cater to the applicants who are strategic and who are actually looking at how you do things and that you're doing things in a good way. With this being said, thank you very much for having me today again, and yeah, speak to you at... That was a sign for me to leave the stage. Thanks.